Hello and welcome to another episode of Archery Releases Ad Nauseum. Today I'm going to do a deep dive into the new for 2022 TRU Abyss Extension Flex. That's a bit of a mouthful, and there is a lot going on with it, so I'm going to dissect it in my usual fashion. I inadvertently wrote a 4,300 word dissertation on this thing, so I tried to edit it down as much as I could. Now, as of the making of this video on July 17th, 2022, there are 4 videos on YouTube about this release. 2 are from TRU, 1 is from Lancaster, and the 4th one is mine. So I wanted to take the opportunity to have the first consumer review on YouTube of the Abyss Extension Flex. So for that reason, the B3 Archery thumb release breakdown that I was going to do in sequence is going to have to wait another 2 weeks. So if anyone was looking forward to that, I apologize for being an opportunist. So personally, I'm not a fan of 2-in-1 releases, and TRU with their Signature series has gotten into the habit of offering releases that have 2 different modes of activation. The idea behind it is to be able to switch between shot execution methods while keeping the same anchor point and possibly the same point of impact. It's also less expensive than buying 2 different releases, even though TRU commands a very high price for their products. The problem is, more often than not, the designers have to make compromises where one mode ends up working better than the other. In order to fit 2 different mechanisms into a small enough package to fit into a release, they often have to take shortcuts, or one has to suffer at the expense of the other. The first of these 2-in-1 releases TRU put out is the GOAT. So the GOAT is meant to give you the versatility of a thumb release and then switch over to a hinge by knocking out a pin or 2 and turning screws. So this isn't something where you can shoot one arrow in hinge mode and then switch over and finish your end in thumb mode. With this release, the hinge action is the one where the compromises were made, as it is often described as being unusual or having a feel of its own. That's different from other hinges. The thumb release mode is the clear winner of the 2, but it's also subject to compromise because it has to have an open hook and it needs to be manually reset. So I don't think the GOAT is really all it's cracked up to be, and I would sooner carry a dedicated thumb and a dedicated hinge so I can switch between them anytime I choose. And that's exactly what I do. Side note, anything that refers to itself as the greatest of all time usually isn't. Anyway, I digress. Another example of a 2-in-1 release is the GoTo, which functions as either a pinky finger release or an index finger with triggers on both ends of the handle. You can also run both triggers simultaneously if you have a good dental plan and can figure out how to draw with just your thumb, middle, and ring finger. As a pinky release, it actually works quite well, but as a handheld index finger release, you have to learn to draw the bow without using your index finger, and you keep it on top of a little spur perched precariously above the trigger. In pinky mode, the index trigger also sits up above the finger beds, so on the draw you have to pull against the flat of the trigger, which is narrower than the finger bed itself and can be uncomfortable after an extended session. So like I said, there is always a compromise, especially when it's not a matter of splitting the difference between 2 things. It's not like a dual-purpose motorcycle where you can take it off-road and then ride it on the street. In that case, it doesn't really excel at either, but both things it can do competently. With archery releases, it's a binary choice of one or the other, and there's only so much room in a release to be able to make both of them function well enough. Now, in the case of the Abyss Extension Flex, the compromise comes with the trigger in thumb release mode, and I'll expand on that later. But before I get into features, I have to address a claim TRU made about this release. So TRU has written on the packaging of the Abyss Extension Flex that this is the first handheld pull-through release to draw a bow like all other handheld trigger releases. No need to hang onto the safety lever while drawing the bow. This statement is blatantly incorrect. This is not the first tension-activated release to draw with your thumb off the safety. It's actually not the second one either. There are currently 2 other releases currently available that function the same as the extension. The first one is the Carter Sensation, and the other is made by Hamskea and comes in the form of the Cure and the Breakthrough. Same release, 2 different sizes. It's like counting it as one right now. So their claim that this is a brand new thing that will take the industry by storm is just plain wrong. Not only is it wrong, but I guess they figured no one would call them on this. I mean, it's pretty easy to figure that out, so just to throw a claim out there like that just seems odd that they would do that. I think they would have known better. The packaging also states that it has the best pressure repeatability on the market when angle and finger placement pressure is consistent shot after shot. I'm not sure if the second part should be interpreted as a disclaimer, if you do your part, the release will do its, or it's just a claim that the adjustability of the release will make it easier to be more repeatable. Either way, I guess time will tell. Alright, now on to features and into the light box. So the main body of the Abyss Extension Flex is nickel-plated brass with an enclosed index finger ring. The rest of the fingers are aluminum, and each has its own independently sweep adjustable joint. TRU refers to it as the lever alignment system. Along with being highly customizable, having the ability to change the angle of the middle finger as well as the ring and pinky allows you to shift the hook either toward your face or away from your face to reduce string contact. So it's about as customizable as you can possibly make it. The inside of the index finger ring is smooth with a narrow flat and a mostly rounded edge, and the rest of the finger beds have checkering on them to increase grip. The checkering is not terribly aggressive, but it does have enough bite to keep your fingers from shifting, and I really wish more manufacturers would do that. So one nitpick that I have to point out is the release body is machined to line up with the middle finger piece only when it's in the fully swept position. You see that little break in the machining right there. When you set the piece fully straight the way it is now, there is a little gap where the corner of the middle finger piece doesn't meet up with the machining on the release body. You can see where my nail's fitting in there. I really don't know how else they could have set that up, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but it is there, and it is something I noticed. You can see a little bit of light shining through that. So while I'm on this side of the release, or I'm showing it, there is a very thin reference mark machined onto the release body, and there is a scale lasered onto the finger extension, so you can put it back together if you ever have to take it apart, and then you can just kind of line up the reference marks to wherever you had them before. Those scales also exist on the spine of the flex fingers, and it's a very nice touch and shows a high degree of attention to detail that TRU has with their releases. They can be kind of complicated, and like I said, there's a whole lot going on here, but they do try to make it as user-friendly as possible by allowing or by providing different scales and things on the release, including some we'll talk about momentarily. So the hook on the Abyss Extension Flex is an open design, and it cannot lock or hang off of a D-loop. So I think this release is going to appeal to target archers a lot more than it will hunters. It doesn't also have a hole to attach a lanyard, so I think that supports my assessment. I really don't think they spent much time thinking about hunters when they were designing this release. So moving along, the trigger stem will accept the 3-axis thumb barrel assembly that TRU offers and sells separately. Some of them, I think the blade and the goat come with it now, which is kind of nice, but this is a $50 assembly, so the more stuff that it comes with, the better. The release comes with the thumb barrel piece of the thumb barrel assembly, but not the additional post to allow it to spin. The thumb barrel is angled on one side, the one that faces the trigger stem, so by rotating it you can change the angle. on it for additional customization. Since the stem is already sticking out pretty far, this pretty much put it where I needed it, and then I just rotated it to get it to the angle that was more on the plane where my thumb is actually sitting. So the stuff that it comes with will probably be enough for you to be able to get that thumb barrel where you want it, but if you have one of these laying around, you can actually use it. So this particular model is the medium, and the Abyss Extension Flex currently comes in medium and large. The sizing is the same as the Abyss and the Fulcrum. The sizing across the TRU line is fairly consistent, so if you use a blade or an HBC, then you'd go with whichever size you use for those. TRU does not provide anything to help you figure out the sizing of their products, so I'm taking it upon myself to do that. If you'd like to see how this release or others compare to your current release or each other, please check out my website for downloadable and printable PDFs of every release I own. Currently there are 129 of them, and I have a few more to add, including the subject of this video. You can find them at artandarchery.com. I will have some sheets on various configurations of the Abyss Flex, Extension Flex, made up after I finish shooting and editing this video. One little aside I want to bring to people's attention regarding sizing. TRU uses the same flex fingers on their medium and large releases. So same piece for two different sizes. The small releases do have downsized flex fingers, but the mediums and larges are exactly the same. So the actual difference in sizes between medium and large TRU releases, with flex fingers anyway, are made on the release body. This is not necessarily a problem, but it's been on my mind for a while, and I've been waiting for an opportunity to point out that I don't know if it is that they're trying to save money by only using one size of flex finger on two different sizes of release, but I thought I'd just point that out. The handle on the Abyss Extension Flex is straight, at least for the index and middle finger pieces. The flex fingers are stepped down a little bit from the main body, so the ring and pinky finger beds are smaller, but they aren't tapered. That being said, since the medium and large flex fingers all have the same interface, you could actually use the flex fingers from a medium or large HBC flex, which are tapered, to see how the release would feel with a tapered handle. Just food for thought, and I think if TRU made the tapered flex fingers of the HBC Flex available for purchase separately from buying a whole nother release, so we could put them on our goats, blades, extensions, etc., they would probably sell very well. So the Abyss Extension Flex utilizes the TriStar hook system that TRU introduced with their Extension RT wrist release. The hook does not need to be reset, since the hook is actually a 3-toothed gear where each tooth is its own hook. It is designed to rotate and present one of the three hooks every time it is fired. The hook doesn't spin freely, but it is free to rotate roughly 120 degrees, and the hook you're supposed to attach to the D-loop, which is that one, can actually be rotated around until it disappears into the body and kind of stays there. So you might try for, if you go to hook up the one that's exposed and find out that's the wrong one. If you go for this one up here, it'll just rotate and then present the next one. So you may have to turn it at some point with your middle finger in order to hold it in place to make hooking up to the D-loop easier. There is no cocking button on this release for the thumb trigger mode, so both modes rely on the tension adjustments to dictate how they behave. The Abyss Extension Flex is primarily a resistance-activated release, where there is a set amount of pressure holding the hook in place, and pressure exceeding that set poundage, which is usually a few pounds higher than the holding weight, has to be applied for the hook to release. All resistance releases have a safety that prevents the hook from releasing on the draw. Some have to be held down and engaged during the draw, and others have to be disengaged at full draw. The Abyss Extension is the latter, where you actually keep your thumb off the thumb peg during the draw, and then you press down at full draw in order to disengage it. Now when you're setting up this release, TRU recommends it be set to 4 pounds above the holding weight of the bow. None of the manufacturers actually explain how the user is supposed to figure out what that number is, but your options are to get a bow scale to figure out your actual holding weight, the bow's holding weight, then hook the scale to the release to see what poundage it is releasing. Then you increase the tension on the release and repeat the test until you get it set where it technically should be for your bow. Then you test it using your bow and make adjustments accordingly, because you may have to fine-tune it based on, because it's not just the holding weight, it's also the amount of pressure you're putting against the stops yourself, so that that number may be higher than you expect. So one way or another, even if you use the tools, you're still going to have to make adjustments when you actually test it on your bow. Similarly to the reference marks on the release body and the flex fingers, they include a red reference marker and a scale on the resistance tension adjustment so you can visually see where in the range of tensions you are currently set. There are no numbers on it, and the marker represents a range in and of itself, but it is handy to be able to see roughly where you are when things are set. You know, if you go this way, you're down at 0, and the higher, it does have a plus and minus, so there is a reference there. It's just not showing up in the picture. It's a little out of focus. So if you don't have a digital bow scale or a spring-based bow scale, your other option is to skip using the scale entirely. Turn this thing down to minimal poundage, which would actually be thumb trigger mode, and slowly turn up the resistance until you can press the thumb barrel down without the hook releasing at full draw. Then you keep turning it up higher until you're comfortable with the amount of pressure you have to apply to get the hook to release. Since the safety has to be pressed down to engage it, this makes setting it up a bit easier compared to a resistance release where you hold the safety down on the draw and release at full draw. With those releases, if you come to full draw, you may get what's called a release trigger, where if the tension is set too lightly, the trigger fires right when you let go of the safety. Interestingly enough, since the safety works in reverse, the Abyss extension uses this condition to facilitate thumb trigger mode. Basically, it's a thumb trigger in reverse. Sticking up above the thumb trigger safety lever assembly is another black lever. This is referred to as the pull-through tension safety lever. When you are using the release in tension mode and you need to let down after you've pressed down and disengaged the safety, you would let go of the safety, reach up, and press this lever in once. You should hear a click, which is the safety resetting or reseating between the hook and the tension mechanism. At that point, it is now safe to let down. I'm thinking if you try to let go of the safety and try to let down without reaching up and pressing this lever, that the hook may still release when your cams roll over. The Carter Attraction also has a recocking lever that performs the same function of re-engaging the safety when letting down. So like I said earlier, this isn't a brand new thing TRU is bringing to the market, but it does seem to be a quirk of this design, where once you disengage the safety, there's nothing between the hook and the mechanism to determine the tension that is required to let it go. Another thing about the TriStar hook system is that it requires tension on the hook to test its operation in both tension and thumb release modes. So adjusting from tension to the thumb trigger mode can be tricky since it's harder to decipher a difference in micro-adjusting tension and travel as opposed to a double sear where you can just sit on your couch with an Allen key set and play with the settings. Ultimately, your accuracy and repeatability is going to determine your optimal setting, but a double sear thumb release like the Stan Onyx makes for a much better fidget toy. So instead of separate mechanisms like the GoTo or the GOAT, the thumb button mode on the Abyss Extension Flex is achieved by reducing the holding weight tension until the trigger safety is the only thing keeping the hook from releasing. As a result, the trigger in thumb mode is a true rolling trigger with no wall or crisp break. It essentially turns this into a single sear, which are some of the least expensive thumb releases you can buy, and you just press down on the trigger, and at some point during its travel, the safety disengages and the hook releases. With the tension setting set up at 0, which I will discuss presently, the hook on mine actually goes off before the thumb barrel itself bottoms out. So if you want the hook to release in thumb mode when the thumb barrel comes to a dead stop at the bottom, you may actually have to put a little bit of extra tension into it and not use the 0 setting. If you want to not be able to predict when the release is going to go off at all, then keep it at 0. According to the instructions, to set it to thumb mode, you turn down the tension after loosening the locking screw, which is right here, until the indicator is bottomed out and the tension adjustment is flush with the bottom of the housing. You would then tighten its locking screw to keep it from moving. After you unlock the tension and travel adjustment screws here and here, you seemingly need 3 hands to accomplish the next step unless you have someone to help you. You need to put tension on the hook with a cord and pull against it while holding the release and turning the travel adjustment screw to reduce the travel. Once you've reduced the travel far enough that the hook releases while you're putting tension on it, you back it off a quarter turn and then test it again by pulling hard on the cord to ensure the hook won't release until you press the trigger. The idea behind that is if you minimize the travel too much, you basically make it think that the safety is disengaged. So the easiest way to actually accomplish this yourself is to tie a cord around something sturdy and then pull against the hook, and that frees your hand up to hold the release and turn the screw. That quarter turn from failure setting will give you the minimum travel the release can safely be operated, and you can operate it in thumb mode with as much or as little travel as you choose, and set it to your preferences. Since the safety is capable of disengaging before the thumb barrel bottoms out, you may need to play with the tension settings if you choose to operate with minimal trigger travel. If you go too close to 0 travel, you might actually end up getting a misfire unless there is some tension on the hook. So there's a little bit of dance to be had with the mechanisms. If you go too short on the travel up here, you may have to add tension because the release may think that the safety is disengaged if it's down too far. There is a separate trigger tension setting on the thumb barrel assembly that is independent of the tension setting for resistance activation. This dictates how hard it is to press this lever down. That tension screw tightens down on a spring that you can actually see at the bottom in the gap here between the trigger stem and the release body. That determines how hard it is to press it down. The tension screw does bottom out and stop, so it's not able to be tightened to the point of falling out of the bottom, but it does limit the amount of tension you can actually put on it. It's not super heavy, but since you can allow a little bit of extra travel, it's not like you're not going to get a hair trigger out of this, even if you set it lighter. The instructions do not specify how much trigger travel is needed for the safety to operate in tension mode. It doesn't need to be fully depressed in order to disengage it, in thumb mode anyway, so you're going to want to increase the travel when you go back to tension mode if you have it set to minimal in thumb. Likewise, you don't want to be pulling hard into the wall unless you actually want it to go off when you disengage the safety in tension mode. Unless you actually want it to go off. If you're trying to force the shot, then just pull hard and then pull it, then pull the safety lever down.
In a world where most companies assemble their products with hex bolts, so their customers only need to carry Allen wrenches, one manufacturer dares to stand alone.
Seriously, Trueball, why do you insist on putting Phillips head screws on your thumb barrel assemblies? These releases are some of the most expensive on the market, and it really makes them look cheap with these screws sitting here. Every other fastener on your releases uses Allen keys, so why not just finish the ensemble? It would look so much better with some button-headed cap screws here instead, and nothing would be lost. Thankfully, all the adjustment and locking screws on the Abyss Extension Flex accept Allen keys that are found on most folding wrench sets that we all carry. The lock screws all accept a 50,000th wrench, the tension adjustment is a 5/64th, the trigger travel screw is a 50,000th, and the trigger tension screw is a 5/64th. The flex fingers are 5/64th, and the lever alignment piece, which is the middle finger, is a 3/32nd. I would prefer if the trigger and tension adjustments were all the same and the finger extensions were all the same, but as long as everything can be adjusted via one folding Allen key set, except the thumb barrel and thumb barrel assembly, which are Phillips head, which drives me crazy, I can live with that. Thankfully, they didn't put any 35,000 set screws on this one like they did the TRU Executive. That still bugs me, and I'm still going to mention that in all of my TRU videos. So I'm generally not a fan of rolling triggers for a variety of reasons. I've always thought the crisper the trigger, the better. That includes firearms as well as archery releases. However, lately I've been forming a running hypothesis that a trigger that has travel should make it easier for the archer to resist the temptation to punch it, and instead actually go through a methodical shot process. At present, I shoot my hinges more consistently my thumbs at this point, and I'm thinking I should be able to, or it should be easier for me to replicate the shot process of a hinge with a trigger like this that rolls through without an identifiable break. So while I think the thumb trigger mode on this release got the short end of the stick, I do think there might be someone out there that may find some value in it. That being said, there are far less expensive releases that will get you the same result as this. I just want to reiterate this. The Abyss Extension Flex has no dedicated lanyard attachment. There are a few spots on it, like around the flex fingers and maybe even on the top of the safety lever where you might be able to get a piece of 275 paracord or D-loop cord, but apparently they didn't think it was necessary, and I think it's a mistake for any release not to have a lanyard attachment. I don't use them personally, but it's good to, better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. As far as adjustability goes, this is the most customizable resistance activated release on the market. It brings some new tech to the market, i.e. the TriStar hook system, but there are similar releases at lower price points that accomplish the same things. Like I said before, the Carter Attraction is basically the same mechanism, and it sells for at least $50 less depending on where you look. However, it is also a solid release that comes in two different sizes and in a 3 and 4 finger solid handle, while the Abyss Extension is what I'm going to start calling a shapeshifter, where you can change it to 3 and 4 and then adjust the sweep and customize it to your needs. Price-wise, the closest resistance release is the Onyx Resistance in aluminum and heavy metal. They do have the shape-shifting capabilities, but they don't have the individually articulated flex fingers, and they don't technically have a thumb mode. They can be set up like a release trigger by reducing the tension and lowering the holding weight, which would cause the hook to release when they let off the safety. They're the other kind of resistance release where you have to hold it in on the draw and then release when you come to full draw. So in conclusion, I hope this was informative. One thing I didn't touch on during the analysis was fit and finish, and that was because TRU's QC is excellent. Other than the Phillips head screws on the trigger assembly, I haven't found a fit and finish issue on any TRU release I own. With the price we pay for them, that should be the way. That should be how it is. I think the release has a lot going for it, though whether the price tag is justified or not is a matter of personal preference. I probably wouldn't have bought one if I wasn't making holsters for it or trying to make YouTube videos, and I don't really see a lot of people gravitating towards it with so many options available that are potentially less expensive. On top of that, target archers tend not to use resistance releases in competition, despite what people on the internet keep saying, since they are very unforgiving of form inconsistencies, not to mention the possibility of actually being mechanically inconsistent. I'm going to see if I can get good groups out of this, and I'll be using it in the future to test the consistency of the mechanisms. I think I've said enough, so I'll leave it at that. Alright, so I just had a few more thoughts and some housekeeping to do with regards to this release. I think in terms of order of operations and what you're going to want to set up first on it, I think you're going to want to make sure that the finger extensions are set up the way that you want them before you spend any amount of time on the tension setting. I don't know if it's going to make as much of a difference in thumb mode. But it probably would if you decide to set it at set the trigger at minimal travel, because then that's going to influence how much pressure is against the hook when you're at full draw. So with the finger extensions being this adjustable, what that ends up doing, whenever you make a change with it, it's going to change the angle of the hook, and then in turn it's going to affect the angle that the string is pulling against the hook. So what that ends up doing is it's going to influence how much pressure you're going to have to set it at in terms of the tension setting. The reason for that is resistance activated releases are very sensitive to form inconsistencies and changes in pressure. And the angle of the string consequently. So if you're pulling with uneven pressure on your fingers, or more pressure on one side during one end and different pressure at the other, it's going to change the way that it's going to make it feel more inconsistent than it is, because you're being inconsistent with it. So user error is a big issue with that. Now with this release, similarly, if you have the tension setting set up the way you want it, and then all of a sudden you decide to change the finger extensions, that changes the leverages on the hook, and then you're probably going to have to go back and change it again because it's going to feel different. So work on this before you really spend a lot of time working on that. And I think that the other issue talking about, I don't think I expanded adequately on as far as string contact and what that does when you change the finger extensions a certain way. When you set the finger extension fully forward like this, where the finger beds are closest to the hook, that pulls the hook away from your face, and you get less face contact at full draw with a fully forward extension, because you're going to pretty much make it sit like that depending on your hand angle. And then likewise, if you bring it back and fully sweep the handle, it's going to bring the hook into your face, and then you're going to have more face contact, and then it's probably going to... The other interesting thing is that if you set it swept, you're more likely to have a linear pull when it comes to the string pulling against the hook. So that's probably going to require less tension to get it to go off. So a couple things I thought of, and hopefully that was helpful. So I think that's about it. I don't think there's anything else that I could possibly cover about this release. So if you like what I'm doing, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I will answer them directly. Also, please check out my Etsy shop at ajbholsters and my website, artandarchery.com. I would love to have you as a customer. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and happy hunting. And I just did that without recording. That was my best take, and I wasn't even recording.